Great, and thank you for the invitation to talk in the series, which I've been enjoying. I'm going to be speaking about work that we've been doing in the field of crystal structure prediction, predominantly working on the crystal structures of small organic molecules. There we go. The motivation behind this work is that we want to be able to understand how the structure of a molecule will influence certain target properties. These might be optical properties like the one I've shown here, a nice fluorescent material, electronic, mechanical, geometric properties such as porosity or reactivity in the solid state. And if we want to understand or perhaps even control properties in the solid state, then there are a few obstacles. One is that we often don't know if we have a target property in mind, what the structure that we need to give that property is, because structure-property relationships are often quite complex. And secondly, even if we knew what structures we wanted, the relationship between a molecular structure and its crystal structure is also difficult. And if we go back, say, 20 years, many people thought this was unpredictable, so something which we could not predict from first principles. So we are working on methods in our research group to solve both of these problems. I'm going to be focusing in today's talk about the first of these, which is crystal structure prediction, with our aim to minimize how much trial and error experimentation we need to discover new materials. So predicting the crystal structure of a small organic molecule is a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but with some important and big differences. What we want to do is go from really just the chemical diagram, so no experimental information apart from bonding information, to the crystal structure, or most likely crystal structures for that molecule. And I can make that analogy with a jigsaw puzzle, okay, where what we're trying to do is take our puzzle pieces and put together a puzzle to get our two-dimensional structure in the end. Okay. Some differences between these. First, one is obvious in that in crystal structures, we're working in 3 dimensions, and that does make things more complex. But a more important difference is that molecules don't fit together perfectly in the solid state. So the packing coefficient of typical organic molecular crystals is almost always in the range of about 65% to 80%. So that means that 20% to 35% of our crystal is essentially free space. And so then if you think back to a jigsaw puzzle, what lets us know when we've put pieces in the right place in that puzzle is that they click together nicely. We don't have that for molecules in a crystal structure. And so here I've shown a molecule with its space-filling diagram here. And I'm showing you a few diagrams of possible ways that we could pack these into a 2-dimensional layer, which all look pretty good in terms of meeting the requirements of close packing that we typically see for organic molecules. Okay. And this is part of the problem in that we have many solutions. And this partly relates to that fact that molecules don't fill space perfectly. The fact that we have free space in there gives us a lot more freedom. Coupled with that, we're working in 3 dimensions, and we typically have many, many possible ways that a small molecule can pack into a crystal structure. Now, of course, we're not blind in terms of chemistry. If we start to put chemical information onto these structures, this can sometimes inform us about which of these are more likely in terms of observable structures. Here, I've colored the atoms of our molecule by the element. And if we have experience as chemists, then we might be able to look at these and make judgments about which of these are then more reasonable packings. This oxygen-fluorine contact perhaps doesn't look favorable, whereas these other ones have something which looks like maybe hydrogen bonding, which might be good. But then we have hydrogen bonding in 3 of these structures that I've shown you, and they're all different. So that doesn't completely lead us to a solution. So we end up calculating energies, and that's the main thing I'll be talking about today. Okay? And the key assumption in crystal structure prediction is that if we predict all of the possible ways that molecules can pack into a 3-dimensional crystal, then the most likely observable structures are those which have the lowest energy. Okay. In reality, we should be talking about free energies. I'm going to leave that to the side for today, and we'll just be talking about the internal or the potential energy of these structures. Now, if we just think about intermolecular interactions, then we have a few key interactions which are going on. We have exchange repulsion, we have dispersion, and we have electrostatics, would be probably the main ones for closed shell organic molecules. The first two of those are really telling us about sterics and close packing. Okay, the dispersion will get molecules close together. That's why we have close packing in crystal structures. And the exchange repulsion keeps molecules from overlapping. So that tells us about the shapes of molecules. And they have very different dependence on the distance between molecules as well. Okay. Then we have electrostatics. Electrostatics is very orientation dependent, and it's strong and specific between certain points on our molecules as well. So this is the interaction then which will start to distinguish between close packed structures. But this leads to some of our difficulties in that the balance between all of these very different types of interactions is what leads us to the best solutions. And it turns out that these are very closely packed in terms of differences in energy. So I'll lead you through the process of crystal structure prediction to give you an idea of how we go about things. We would start off with a two-dimensional chemical diagram. As I've said, all we have is bonding information. We will have to expand that up to a three-dimensional molecular structure to be our building block of our crystal structures. This will rely on quantum chemical type calculations, which for small molecules like this can be quite reliable in giving us a three-dimensional molecular structure. We then go through a process of packing these into trial crystal structures. In our group, we use mainly low discrepancy or quasi-random sampling of our structure space, which the dimensions in this space correspond to our unit cell. So lengths and angles of the unit cell, which defines our translational symmetry of crystal structures. And then we have orientations and positions of molecules within that unit cell. So we're typically thinking about a dimensionality of this problem, or the lattice energy surface that we're sampling here, somewhere around 30 dimensions or so would be typical. And what we're aiming to do is find all of the local minima on that energy surface via some sampling of that structural space, followed by local energy minimization. So the sampling typically involves generating perhaps tens of thousands or millions of trial crystal structures. And I've shown you a sampling of those for this molecule artemisinin, which I'm showing here. We will then screen those to get rid of any physically unreasonable structures. And then we'll locally energy minimize those which look reasonable to us. Okay. And that energy minimization typically uses in our group a mixture of force field methods, because we need to be quick if we're going to energy minimize on the order of tens, hundreds of thousands of crystal structures. But then the balance to that is that we also need accuracy in the final energies. Okay. And so in the end, we may also use some quantum mechanics, maybe solid state, density functional theory, to get some final energies of our structures. If we have sampled well, then we'll typically have duplicates on our energy surface. So we will get each distinct crystal structure. We should identify it more than once in our sampling. We remove those, and then we come up with a final ranking of structures. And if you read the crystal structure prediction literature, often you'll see plots like this, where each dot on this plot is a distinct crystal structure, so it's different from the rest. Lattice energy is on the vertical axis, so the most stable structures are at the bottom, and we separate things out by either volume per molecule or density, okay, just to separate out the points corresponding to different crystal structures. Now, so that gives you one example of an energy landscape. This one here is for this small molecule here. And the typical energy range we're interested in when we're looking then for which structures may be experimentally observable is going to be defined by the energy range that we normally see observed crystal structures. So something I haven't mentioned yet is the phenomenon of polymorphism. And this is where a given molecule can crystallize in more than one crystal structure. Okay. And this is actually quite prevalent for organic molecules. And we can use the observation of polymorphism to tell us about the relevant energy range. Okay. So we have looked, and this was a few years back in this paper, in 2015, we looked at a very large set, several hundred observed polymorph pairs of organic molecules and calculated energy differences. And what we find is that the energy differences are typically very small, 1 or 2 kilojoules per mole between observed polymorphs. sometimes ranging up to about 7 or 8 kilojoules per mole. So if we assume that one of those structures always corresponds to our global lattice energy minimum, then that range tells us about the range in which we should be interested in predicted crystal structures. So we'll normally show plots like this over a range of about 7 kilojoules per mole or so. This one here, I've shown 5 kilojoules per mole, and we have about 75 distinct crystal structures in that range. So they're separated by very small energy differences. Okay. So on the right, I show you another example of a molecule we worked on just a couple of years ago. This is a very well-studied molecule, trimesic acid. Okay. Sometimes, if we find the right crystallization conditions, we can break these rules about polymorphism. Here, the points on our plot, our energy, in this case, versus density plot, are colored according to how well the simulated powder diffraction pattern from each of these predicted crystal structures matches something we found in the lab with some collaborators in Liverpool who are doing a screen of crystallization conditions of trimesic acid. And the dark red points are those which match the best. And what we found was that there was a structure up here which corresponded on our energy surface about 20 kilojoules per mole up from the global energy minimum, okay, which in the end turned out to be a new structure which was found in the lab. Okay, so sometimes we're interested in very large energy ranges on these landscapes. In this case, if we drew a line across this landscape just above that new observed polymorph of trimesic acid, we would be looking at about 20,000 distinct crystal structures below that line. So we need methods, again, which are quick in terms of evaluating the energies of very large numbers of structures. Okay. So for this reason, we typically take a hierarchical approach to the way we calculate energies. We need to be fast at the beginning of calculations, or we're doing millions of structures. So we typically use very fast force field methods to initially screen and energy minimize structures, pass these on to then higher level calculations once we have ruled out some of the higher energy structures and discarded them. And then we may have several tiers in this type of an approach. Okay? So we may move from fast force fields to better force fields, to then cheap quantum mechanical methods, and then expensive quantum mechanical methods. Okay, and it's just so we can control the cost of these calculations. To give you an idea of relative cost, the force fields we're normally using at the beginning of crystal structure prediction, if we assigned an energy calculation for a force field a unit of 1, then if we went to solid state density functional theory, we'd be talking about a unit of 1,000. And if we went to the best solid state density functional theory calculations, say using hybrid density functional theory, we would be talking about hundreds of thousands. Okay, so it's a big jump up in terms of cost that we need to control. Okay. So a question we had a few years back is, can we try to shortcut that so that we reduce the number of calculations we need to perform at those highest levels of theory? Okay. And the reason we thought there may be a good approach to this is that we have lots of structures available to us via crystal structure prediction, all for the same molecule, possibly. And so this is very rich in terms of information relating structure to energies. Okay, so the question we had is, does a small fraction of the structures on the energy landscape, shown here perhaps by a sampling of those ones highlighted in red, do they contain enough information to make predictions about the higher level energies from structures calculated at a lower level? Okay, so I'm going to be talking in the rest of the talk about work from these 3 papers over the past 3 years. And the main sort of approach we're taking is we're perform crystal structure prediction at a low cost energy model. We're then going to train a machine learning model to learn about the energies at higher levels using some descriptor of structure, and we're going to use those models to predict higher level energies. And I'm going to talk about a few approaches we've taken to that. Okay. Now, the main approach that we've tried a few approaches. The main one I'll talk about today is Gaussian process regression. Essentially, this is a method for linking the differences in structures that we see to changes in response. Here, the response being the energy of a structure, or energy correction from, say, a low level to a high level energy for a structure. Okay. And that link is built through a kernel, okay, where here we have descriptors of structure. And this tells us that this is a similarity measure then between structures. So our Gaussian process regression is sort of building up sort of the distribution of functions which fit through our points which we know about. So say these red points may be calculations that we know at high level for particular structures. So our horizontal axis is telling us about structure, and our vertical axis is the response, the energies or energy differences between those structures. Okay, so that's the main method we're using. In terms of descriptors of structure, what we're using, I actually have a mixture of things within the talk. Some of the work here is used this SOAP descriptor, where when we're looking at the two different structures and comparing them, what we do is we build up local environments of atoms. Okay, and we compare those through a kernel function, which is sort of an integral of an overlap of smoothed out atomic distributions around atoms within our molecule. Okay. And the second approach we've used are these atom-centered symmetry functions, which are a similar type of thing where we put Gaussians radially around our atoms within a molecule and at an angular distribution, and we pick up where atoms are around our atoms there. Okay, so we're getting information, local information of atomic structure around the atoms within our molecule, and using that to compare structures between crystal structures predicted for a molecule. So the first foray into this for us was this paper here in 2018, where we were looking at predicted crystal structure landscapes for these three molecules here: pentacene, a fairly well-known organic semiconductor, and a couple of molecules that had come out of this earlier study in our group, where we are doing some screening using crystal structure prediction for potential new organic semiconductors. But we decided to look at the energy landscapes we had got from that work, okay, and start to apply these methods to see if we could use machine learning to speed up the approaches we're using. So one question we had at the beginning, before we start to try to learn any energies, is we wanted to look at how well do our structural descriptors capture information about structural similarities between crystal structures. Because all of the descriptors we're using, either the SOAP or the symmetry functions, are telling us about local information around atoms in our molecule. So what we did was we took our landscapes, say the landscape for pentacene, and as I said, this is somewhere in sort of 30-dimensional space or so, and we used some dimensional reduction methods to take those structures and plot them in 2 dimensions so that we're looking at sort of the structures which are similar in terms of our descriptors we're using are plotted nearby each other in this 2-dimensional representation. Okay, and the method we used here was the sketch map method. I've also applied then some hierarchical density-based clustering to highlight those structures which cluster into what look like families of structures. And the nice thing is that for a structure like pentacene, then we already know what types of structures we should be looking for. Okay? These molecules are known to pack in a few common packing types in the crystal structures, which I've shown in the top right here. So if we went through this structure set of predicted crystal structures and classified things manually, then I have this color coding on the right, okay, which is plotted on that sketch map representation. And what we see is that the clustering based on the SOAP descriptor is actually very faithful to what we do if we do things manually. So it is capturing structural information which is useful and matches with what we typically see when we look at these crystal structures. Okay. So we then went on to try to apply these to, we're using the Gaussian processing now to predict energies. So this pentacene landscape, we took all structures within about 20 kilojoules per mole of the global energy minimum, which is a bit over 560 structures. And the first thing we did was say, okay, could we just predict the solid state density functional theory calculated relative energies of these structures just from the geometrical descriptors using Gaussian processing? And this is what we get. And so of course it depends on what fraction of the number of structures you include in your training set for the Gaussian processing. And so we have this training curve here, which I show in red. And when you're down at about 10%, then your errors relative to calculating things exactly with density functional theory are somewhere around 1 kilojoule per mole, which is actually pretty good. So this is telling us that this is going to be possibly a useful approach. We can get the errors down to about half a kilojoule per mole if we take our training set right up to include actually maybe 80%. of the predicted crystal structures. Okay. And we can, if we choose the training structures in a better than a random way, we can actually improve this a little bit more. But then we look at the other two molecules in our set and we see things get worse. And we can, as chemists, we can rationalize why this is. We're going from pentacene, where everything really is repulsion dispersion. There's not much in terms of directional electrostatics going on, to these aza-substituted pentacenes, where now we have very strong polar interactions. Okay. So the types of interactions are getting more complex. We're throwing in additional types of interactions with different orientational dependence and different radial dependence, and so that we can expect is going to be harder to learn for a model. Okay, so this increasing complexity of molecular structure leads to larger errors in the machine learned model. And we can look at this. We look at the eigenvalues of the kernel matrices. So these are the SOAP kernels telling us about similarities between structures. Then what we see is that for the molecules where the errors are larger, then we see that the eigenvalues are larger. And so what we have is, in this high dimensional space, we have a more diverse set of structures, and we have fewer structures which are nearby to each other, which is where we get information through Gaussian processing. So we can understand why we see these errors creeping up. Now, something we do know, we looked at, was that the starting energies that we had for our structures, which are from force fields, actually correlate reasonably well with the energies that we're trying to learn, which are the more expensive solid state density functional theory energies. Correlation's not great, but this tells us there may be a smarter way to do things. And that smarter might be not to learn directly the density functional theory energies, but to learn a correction to the force field. So we looked at that as well. So here on top, I'm showing you those initial results for the three molecules, where we were directly learning the density functional theory relative energies. Okay. And we had these errors for the 5B, the worst molecule, a little bit above 2 kilojoules per mole at a 10% training fraction. If we change the way we do things and instead we use the Gaussian processing to learn the difference between density functional theory relative energies, force field relative energies, then we can bring this down quite a bit. Okay, so it's sort of a delta learning type method. Okay, and the reason why that works is because some of the complexity in terms of the interactions that we have, which are going on in the aza substituted pentacenes, are captured quite well by the force field. So we may as well use that as a baseline for our predictions. Okay, so that improves things. A year later, I had a PhD student, David McDonough, working on things, and we decided to look at a different approach to the way we can learn these energy corrections. And it was partly thinking about how we make things more reliable when we have more complex interactions going on, because these pentacenes are really quite simple molecules. And the approach that we started to look at was a fragment-based energy approach. Okay. So we have our total lattice energies calculated from our force field. And what we thought was, rather than perform quantum mechanics calculations on the solid state structure, the periodic structure, what we would do is we would correct dimer and perhaps trimer or higher order energies within those structures using quantum mechanics. Okay. So what we do is we take our force field, calculated structure, we pull out dimers from that structure. So say the central molecule and this neighbor here, and we calculate the energy for that dimer at a higher quantum mechanical level of theory, and calculate the difference between that dimer energy at the force field and that quantum mechanics level. Okay. And we correct then the force field lattice energy with these quantum mechanics dimers. Okay. The reason we thought this might be useful is because it increases quite dramatically the amount of information we have for the machine learning. So if we look at some molecules we looked at in this study here, if we look at the number of crystal structures we had available, we typically have a few hundred. Each crystal structure will often give us 20 or 30 distinct dimers. Okay, so then we're getting a lot more in terms of information and calculated data points that can go into the machine learning. Okay, we're now up at sort of tens of thousands of data points. So for each of these, we calculated these dimer corrected energies at a few different types of quantum mechanical levels of theory. And this is another advantage of this approach, is that We can perform periodic quantum mechanics calculations. We're pretty much restricted to density functional theory. If we take things down to dimers and trimers, etc., we have a much wider range of methods available to us, such as perturbation approaches, configuration interaction approaches, etc. Okay, so we tested the methods out by calculating everything explicitly, all of these dimer corrections. Here's our force field energy surface for this small molecule oxalic acid. And the two known polymorphs of this are highlighted here. So something we know about these experimentally is that they're actually almost isoenergetic. The energy difference between alpha and beta polymorphs of oxalic acid is only a couple of tenths of kilojoules per mole. So we know that the picture from the force field is qualitatively incorrect. And that's why we actually picked this molecule as a testing ground. If we MP2 correct, so this is a quantum mechanics method we can use, that energy surface using dimers from MP2, then we get this energy surface. And now the energy difference between alpha and beta actually matches some of the best calculations that are out there in terms of the solid state, which come from Chichenko's group. Okay, so we know the method works well. And so then we start to look at the machine learning approach. Okay, and so now we're learning dimer correction. So I have it here on the top as a function of training fraction. We're looking at our errors as a function of the fraction of dimers we've calculated. I'll focus on these MP2 calculations. And on the bottom, we then have this summed up to our total lattice energy, okay, showing how that impacts on the total errors. And on the right, I'm showing you the individual data points, the dimers and the lattice energies. So when we're at 10%, you can see how well we're doing. And as we increase the training fraction, things really tighten up and we can get very good predictions. So this method looks pretty well. We can look at the whole landscape from this force field prediction on the left to the quantum mechanics predicted energy landscape on the right, which we believe to be quite accurate. And then we can look at how well we do at different training fractions of these dimer corrections. Even at 10%, the landscape is looking pretty faithful to our target landscape. And when we get to 20% dimers, then the differences are really very, very small. Okay. This means we're saving ourselves a factor of 5 or perhaps 10 in terms of the number of calculations we need to perform by doing the Gaussian processing. What we really care about in the end in our crystal structure prediction is actually the energy ranking of our crystal structures. So we also looked at the rank correlation between the predicted energy landscape and our target landscape, which was where we've done all of the quantum mechanics calculations. You can compare this to the rank correlation from the force field to the target landscape. So our force fields, we chose challenging molecules where we know the force fields are doing quite poorly. So the rank correlation coefficient is only about 0.5, 0.6. So actually the ranking of those structures is pretty bad. When we get up to 10 and 20%, we can get that up to about 0.9, 0.95. So we're getting all of our rankings across the landscape mostly correct now. And finally, this is from last year, is another approach or building on what we've been doing in this area. And this is where we think back now to this hierarchical approach that we take in terms of lattice energy calculations, where we're actually making use of several different levels of computational theory when we're calculating our lattice energies. And we're now going to start incorporating that into the machine learning approach as well. Okay, so we have this paper from last year on multi-fidelity statistical machine learning methods. I'm going to talk about this oxalic acid molecule again, because it's a very nice challenging test for our methods, because we know the force fields don't do very well. We can just have a look at it in a single level type of approach. So this is just using the same type of Gaussian processing on total density functional theory energies. Okay, so in the same way that we did for pentacene. Okay. And one thing that I didn't show for pentacene is that the difference you can make in terms of a smart choice of our training structures. Okay. So here we have randomly chosen structures for our training of our Gaussian processing versus a space filling model, where we're trying to choose structures which are maximally diverse, okay, using this maxi-min model. And actually at low training fractions, these two methods actually work fairly similarly. They start to distinguish each other when you get to higher training fractions. So if you really want accuracy, then using these methods like maximin may be useful for you. But the other thing to look at from here is that our starting point is worse. Remember, at 10% training fraction for pentacene, we were already at about a kilojoule per mole in terms of errors. Here we're above 2. So we know this is a harder molecule that we're working on. Correlations between energy models. Okay, so what we did was we did calculations here using our force fields, using what's now fairly standard density functional theory in the solid state, using a GGA functional, or we use PBE, and also applying then a hybrid functional. This gets very expensive. Okay, so to give you an idea, for just under 500 crystal structures predicted for this molecule, it takes us under a minute to calculate the energies with the force field. It takes us about half a day with the GGA functional, and it took us, if we didn't parallelize things, it would take 101 days with the hybrid functional. So it's a very steep increase in cost. Okay, but we can look at now the correlations between the energies that we calculate with all those levels. Okay, on the far left we have the force field versus this PB, which is now our intermediate energy model. Okay, there's some correlation there, but you can see quite a bit of scatter. But then you go to the PB and the PB0, which are then our intermediate and our high level energy calculations, and there's a strong correlation. So what that tells us is that if we could use a lot of these intermediate calculations, which are not absurdly expensive, we could learn a lot of this scatter, and then maybe we can get away with only a few structures to learn then the jump to the very highest level. Okay, so that's what we're going to try. So we developed an autoregressive Gaussian processing model. It's a multi-fidelity approach. So it's now going to take information from these 3 levels. We start with the force field. We use information that we know that we have a correlation of the intermediate level, which is our PBE GGA functional, with the force field. And then we use Gaussian processing to learn the difference, the scatter. And then we have a higher level correction, which again uses correlation between the intermediate and the high level, and a Gaussian process to learn the scatter from that correlation. Okay, and I show 3 plots here. Okay, what I'm showing on the left is then if I use this multi-fidelity approach, and to explain the way we describe our training sets, what I use here is 30% of our structures we perform the intermediate level calculations on. And then of that 30%, we take 30% of them and we perform the highest level calculation. So we're actually performing the very highest level calculation only on 9% of our structures here. And you can now see the correlation between predicted and the true high level energies. And we're getting down to about 1 kilojoule per mole errors, which is pretty good. If we had done this in a single Gaussian processing regression approach, then if we'd done things with just the 30% training set on the high energy level calculation, then we get similar errors, but that's about 3 times more expensive. Okay, so you're already seeing that we have a gain by having the intermediate level in there. If we had done things only at the 9% of structures from our highest level, then our errors shoot up. So again, showing the gain we have from having the intermediate level in there. Okay, so this looks like a useful approach to us. Just a few final things to show from it. Now we have sort of 2 dimensions in our choice of training fractions. We have training fraction of the intermediate level and the high level. So we can look at errors here, and I'm showing errors. This is a continuous sort of version of mean absolute errors, okay, which takes into account the distribution of energies that we're calculating. But think of this as like mean absolute errors. Then these contours I've shown you here are where we get better than 2 kilojoules per mole errors, 1 kilojoule per mole, and half a kilojoule per mole. So this can inform us in terms of where we want to be. And on the right, we have cost. Now, a unit of cost here corresponds to doing 1% of our structures at the very highest level. Okay. And what we find here is we can get better than 1 kilojoule per mole accuracy with this multi-fidelity approach by taking, in the case of oxalic acid, only about 4.2% of the structures, or the cost of doing 4.2% of structures at the very highest level, compared to what we had before, which was we could get only 2 kilojoule per mole errors with about 10% of our structures with the single level approach. And for other molecules we looked at in this study, we get cost savings, which are down at about 5 or 6% as well. So this is looking like a good approach to us. We can also look at rankings in the end. because this is what matters to us, okay? And a key thing about the Gaussian processing is we don't just get a mean predicted error energy, but we get a distribution of these. So we can sample from that distribution. So here what we've done is taken a particular training set. Here it's the set that gets us below 1 kilojoule per mole errors. So the lowest cost model that gets below 1 kilojoule per mole average errors. And we take 10 to the 5th samples from that distribution to rank our structures. So each structure now gets a distribution of rankings, and that's useful to us because it can tell us about our confidence that each structure might sit as the global energy minimum or somewhere above it. These rank 1 and 2 structures are the observed polymorphs for this molecule, and the model shows us that at this training level, then those are predicted with pretty high certainty to be structures 1 and 2 in our set. Okay, and that's the type of information we would want to then start to inform some experiments, like do we need to go on in the lab to look for more crystal structures? I should start to wrap up there. So just to summarize things, I hope you see that the machine learning approach works pretty well for this application in crystal structure prediction because we have very rich landscapes that tell us about structure-energy relationships. The simple models can very quickly get us to errors of kilojoule per mole using only 10% of the computational cost, but we can do better. And we can do better by taking a few different approaches, this fragment-based approach or these multi-fidelity approaches, and now maybe starting to mix those as well. I need to thank people who funded the work, computing we've had access to, and people here that I've worked with on these projects. And thanks for your attention.